Meeting of the Climate Change Committee to order. And let me just say how nice it is to see everyone in person. I hope here we are. We're doing it. And, for folks who have joined or will listen to this recording, welcome and thank you for participating in this morning's meeting. I think there might be a few meeting announcements that we want to get started with. So I'm going to turn it over to the CMAP staff to share any logistical announcements we have before we take the attendance roll.
All right. Thank you very much, Chair Dernbaugh, and thank you all for being here this morning. We are very happy to have you in person at our office. We've missed you, so thank you to the Open Meetings Act for giving us a reason to be together in person. We hope you get a chance to check out the office and the building while you're here. Some of our staff will be offering a building tour after the meeting, which I would recommend. It's a great chance to learn about the history. The meeting is being recorded and live streamed. So while we are here in person, we will be joined by some people online. So for that reason, we'd like you to use the microphones when you speak. The microphones in front of you, when the light is red, they're off. But if you're speaking, if you could please just press the button until the light turns green, and then people online will be able to hear you. For those of you who are with us online, welcome. We'd ask you to please use the mute function. And let us know in the chat, which our staff will be monitoring, if you would like to speak. If you have a question during the meeting, you can use the chat box. We also have a public comment period at the end of the meeting. If you'd like to make a public comment, please let us know and you'll have the opportunity at the end of the meeting. I believe that is the conclusion of my meeting announcements. Jamie, was there anything else? Great, thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. And at this point, we will now call the roll. Staff, or Brian, could you please call the roll?
Great, thank you. Chair Aaron Dernbaugh.
Present.
Vice Chair Deborah Stone. Jack Chan.
Present.
Naomi Davis. Martha Dooley.
Present.
Elena Grossman. Samira Hanessian.
Present.
Cynthia Canner.
Present.
Marcella Bondi-Keenan. Elizabeth Coach. Thomas Maillard.
Present.
Edith Macra.
Present.
Red Mansour. Paul May.
Present.
Mary Nickel.
Present.
Vanessa Ruiz. Matthew Santagata.
Present.
And Chris Young.
Present.
Great, and we have a quorum.
Terrific. We came here for a purpose. Everyone should have received the agenda in the meeting invitation, and it was also posted online. Have there been any changes to the agenda?
No changes to the agenda, thanks.
Now we will move on to announcements. This morning, we have Bill Barnes, the Deputy of Regional Policy and Implementation with us, and he will deliver the Executive Director's announcements. Bill?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the old post office for those of you who braved rush hour traffic to come in. For those of you who are online, we welcome you in future meetings. As Brian said, there are going to be tours of the office. It's quite fascinating what they've done here at this old historic building. So we urge you to take a look at it. We got a full agenda today. We're going to be talking about flood equity. We're going to have an update and brief discussion on PART, the Plan of Action for Regional Transit, something that's been on the agenda repeatedly throughout the years. So we want to bring you up to speed on all the work we've been doing there and its intersection with climate. And then we're just going to talk about regional climate planning. But a couple of updates for you. So from a legislative standpoint, we have a new staff in our legislative or governmental affairs group, Chad Phillips. He's focused on federal affairs and sort of building and maintaining our relationship with the congressional delegation. He comes to us from Senator Duckworth's office, so we're super excited to have him and fill a hole that was created with a recent vacancy. From an IIJ working group standpoint, one of the things Chad is going to be working on with CMAP staff is to reconvene the IIJ working group. And this group, as you may remember, has been discussing a future approach to developing a list of regional priority projects for competitive IIJA grant opportunities. So we'll keep you up to date on that process as the team continues its work. From a state legislation standpoint, the General Assembly passed a $50.6 billion budget just before Memorial Day. We've been tracking several bills related to CMAP priorities over the course of the session. And one bill that the governor recently signed that may be of interest to you is Public Act 103-53, which requires all new single-family homes and multifamily buildings to include EV-capable parking, something that I believe is near and dear to us all. So more information will be shared on that in the latest CMAP climate newsletter. Quick update on our Safe Travel for All Roadmap program. That's the STAR program. We have successfully secured a fully executed grant agreement from FHWA for the Safe Streets and Roads for All funding. Our region was awarded nearly $5 million from USDOT in response to a joint application submitted by CMAP and IDOT in partnership with the 6 counties in the region. So our next step is to begin creating safety action plans in partnership with those counties. This multi-year effort will improve traffic safety in our region in a comprehensive, equitable, data-informed, and collaborative way. It will focus on speed management and improving safety for people walking, rolling, and riding bicycles. And this effort will benefit our climate by encouraging a shift in active modes of travel by making it safer to choose alternative means of transportation. Turning to the Regional Infrastructure Accelerator Grant, the RIA grant, I just want to give you an update on the application that we recently submitted for the 290 Blue Line Corridor, which was done in partnership with IDOT and the CTA. This project aims to develop a unified vision for the corridor and create a governance structure to execute on that vision. The project approach will be similar to that which you've seen in the CREATE program, and the funding will allow CMAP to advance the I-290 Blue Line project by implementing a project framework that fosters interagency collaboration, leverages stakeholder expertise, and utilizes a project management office to provide critical technical support for project sequencing, financing, coordination, and public engagement. We will, of course, keep you updated on the progress of that project. And then finally, just a quick note related to CMAP's involvement with the Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson's transition. Executive Director Alaman served on the Transportation Transition Subcommittee along with several other members of our CMAP staff. This group helped to shape the early transportation priorities for the new administration, and transit was a big focus of the group's discussions, leveraging all the work that we've been doing in the PART project. The report was just published a few weeks ago, and we look forward to working with Mayor Johnson's administration to implement the recommendations. And before I turn it back to the chair, I just want to thank our liaisons, Brian Daly and Jamie Jackson, for all the work they've done in supporting this committee. They have tirelessly wrangled CMAP staff to ensure that you all have a curated conversation presented to you each quarter. It's a time-consuming and thoughtful process, and I'm really proud of the work that I've seen out of them. At the next quarter's meeting, you will see new liaisons that will most likely leverage the new programs that are being created here at CMAP. But we do want to thank Brian and Jamie for their work. So thank you very much, and you will be missed. And that's all I have, Chair.
Thank you very much. Were there any questions for Bill on the director's report? Well, yes, we will miss, and I'll just say, as the chair, since I get to work really closely with the two of you, thank you for your support, getting me into these meetings prepared and ready to rock and roll. So If there are no questions, we'll move on to the next item, which is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting. A copy of those minutes from April 25th were included in the meeting packet. Were there any, if hope folks had a chance to look and review those, were there any changes or corrections anyone saw for the minutes? If none, then could I please request a motion and a second to approve those minutes?
So moved. Waukegan, Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas. And seconded. There was a motion and a second to approve the minutes. Could we get a call for?
Well, as a special treat for you all for coming in person today, we don't have to do a roll call vote for minutes anymore. So
Wow,
voice
look at
vote
us.
is fine.
Okay. So all those in favor? Any opposed? Thank you very much. Moving on to the next item. We're moving on to item 4.0, new business. The first item of business is a report on the resources for equitable flood resilience and a overall project update. This item will share how CMAP's applying an equity lens to flood resilience investment decisions and updating the flood susceptibility indices. We'll get a presentation from Kate Evasic, Senior Planner. Thank you, Kate.
Okay, hi, good morning, everyone. It's so good to see you all here. It's been a long time. So yeah, as Chair Dernbaugh just said, I'm really here to give you an update on two projects that are really focused on developing new and revamping some old resources to really drive equitable flood resilience investment in the region. So the first, next slide, sorry. So the first project is focused on updating our regional flood susceptibility index. And the second is focused on developing some new resources, both data and guidance, to really help integrate equity into flood resilience investments that can be used by CMAP, by county governments, municipal partners, and others in the region. Next slide. So for this work, we received congressionally directed spending, or an earmark, to support this work with some additional funding from the MacArthur Foundation. And the MacArthur Foundation's contribution was really helpful to allow us to compensate the contributions of 5 community-based organizations that brought their time and expertise to really help drive and shape the development of the equity guide. We started this work in September of last year, and the earmark funding is for 1 year. So we're coming up on the 1 year time frame for that money. So we have a lot of work to do, but really CMAP is committed to continuing this work in the future. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you see me again at a future meeting talking about the same work. And we couldn't do this work alone, so we had technical support from CNT as well as Geosyntec consultants for stormwater. And then, as I mentioned, we partnered with 5 community-based organizations, and they were Austin Coming Together, Cicero Community Farm, Clean Power Lake County, OAI, and the Southeast Environmental Task Force, which is on the southeast side of Chicago. Next slide, please. So in addition to working with the community-based organizations, we also engaged a range of stakeholders. Some of you are in the room, so thank you for the time that you dedicated to both of these projects. We've worked with MWRD as well as other county stormwater agencies and some other departments, county-based departments that focus on flooding in their work as well. We've met with some municipalities in the region as well as NGOs and really others working in the resilience and equity spaces, researchers and climate scientists as well. So what I want to do now is just give a brief overview of the 2 projects, just to give some context before jumping into our discussion questions today. So starting with the flood susceptibility index on the next slide. This is a project that stems back from 2017. CMAP at that time created 2 indexes, both an urban and a riverine flood susceptibility index. Is there a delay on the slide, perhaps? Sorry. And so the flood susceptibility index was really our way to try to identify some larger scale priorities across the region for stormwater and flood mitigation activities, and I would say resilience planning in general. So with these indexes, the susceptibility scores range from 1 to 10. 1 being the least susceptible and 10 being the most susceptible. And these scores are based on the relationship between flood locations that actual flood reports and various different landscape and infrastructure characteristics like impervious cover, where water can expect to pool and pond, communities with combined sewers, which we know have significant challenges with flooding, as well as the age of development in the communities. So CMAP continues to see value in continuing to further and continue to use this index. So we're undergoing an effort to update it, hopefully by the end of this year. And this really stems from, both our internal use and understanding of the index, but also from the fact that we continue to hear support from partners that would like to use the index and have better access to it, manipulate it. And so we want to be responsive to that. And of course, we just saw some really devastating flooding in the region in Cook County. And so we know that this is the type of data that's there's gonna continue to be a need for, and so we need to be at the forefront of that. So on the next slide, I wanted to talk through 3 different ways that we're updating the flood susceptibility index. First, we're going to improve data inputs, and we're going to do this by incorporating some flood location data from more recent storms. And importantly, we're also going to capture 311 call data that reports basement flooding in the city of Chicago, and that was information that we didn't have access to in 2017. And then we're also looking at adding in some new flood-related factors. And the flood-related factors are really what creates the index. So we're looking at some runoff factors like how soils play a role, as well as overland flow paths, and also some watershed-based characteristics too we're exploring this time around. For the methodology, we're using the same statistical approach as we did last time, and we want to do this so we can be consistent across the 2 versions and have be able to compare that. But we want to do some more rigorous testing this time around. We want to test the factors before we run the analysis to make sure that we're using factors that are really relevant to either riverine flooding in the case of the Riverine Index and urban flooding in the case of the Urban Index. And we're also modifying the geography of the index. So the Urban Index will cover all developed areas in the region. Currently, it excludes the floodplains. So that's an advancement. And then as far as the Riverine Index, we want to use the 500-year floodplain instead of the 100-year floodplain to really account for the more recent rainfall trends that we've been seeing and have it be a bit more forward-looking. And then finally, we want to provide the index in a more user-friendly and accessible format. Currently, it's on our data hub. You can download it and you need ArcGIS to do anything with it. So we want to create a web map to make it more accessible. And we also want to provide better access to the underlying data, so the flood factors that really go into creating the index, so that users can look at those underlying factors to get a better understanding of why a particular area may be scoring high or moderate in the index. And then we're also going to be providing some guidance on how the index could be rescaled to a different geography. So currently it's at the scale of the region. So we want to provide some guidance on how you could do that to rescale to a county, maybe Council of Governments could be like another geography that it could be relevant for. And so we want to improve that as well. So finally, on the next slide, I just wanted to walk through some of the applications that we've seen as current uses for the index, as well as future uses as well. And first and foremost, it's been used quite a bit as a preliminary screening tool to really identify priority areas that may be more susceptible to flooding, or also confirm or verify known problem areas. It's also been used to identify and prioritize stormwater planning assistance across a county. It could be used, as I mentioned, at Council of Governments. We know MWRD has done this to use as a preliminary screening tool. It can also be used with other data to guide project funding. And then finally, while the index can be used as a standalone to just see the susceptibility scores and have that inform planning and decision-making, this time around, as I mentioned, we're also going to provide those underlying flood-related factors that can be used individually or in conjunction with the index to get a better understanding of the flood issues. So on the next slide, what I want to talk about now is the second project, which is really resulting in a pretty brief guide to really aimed at helping planners and engineers integrate equity approaches into stormwater and flood mitigation investments. This will also guide what CMAP's work does, what we do in the coming years. And the guide, it identifies some key principles, some strategies. We're compiling data, equity-focused data, and then it also highlights some best practices and uses some local and national examples where community groups, governments, NGOs, and others have really been successful at advancing equity in their work. So on the next slide, in collaboration with our community-based organization partners, we identified 5 key principles that are really essential for advancing equity and addressing past harms and current challenges faced by communities that have been disinvested, marginalized, and disproportionately impacted by flooding. And these are first centering community voices in decision-making, intentional trust building between governments and local communities, prioritized or targeted investments to areas that are disproportionately impacted by flooding, holistic solutions that achieve multiple benefits, and long-term planning that anticipates the needs over the entire lifespan of the investment. So next, we narrowed in on 5 strategies that generally follow the project development process of planning and analysis and using data, meaningful community engagement, project development and design, mitigating unintended consequences that may be at play. We have a strategy focus on maintenance and operations, really looking at the entire lifespan of the investment. And then finally, helping municipalities, in particular lower capacity municipalities, access the wealth of funding that's out there to address these issues. And as I mentioned earlier, the guide details best practices and it uses case study examples, both local and nationally, to really illustrate what they look like in practice. So finally, our timeline for the next 6 months looks like this. We're in the process of revising the equity guide based on feedback that we're getting from stakeholders. And we particularly want to touch on the impacts that were experienced by communities, especially communities that we've been working with in this most recent flood on July 2nd. So we're going to be finalizing the guide and the methodology to update the flood susceptibility index in August per our grant terms. And then over the fall, we're going to run the flood susceptibility index and develop communication materials for both projects. So this means that hopefully we have a flood susceptibility index, an updated one to share and promote by the end of the year or soon after. And then into winter, we're going to analyze the flood susceptibility index along with equity focused data on income, race and ethnicity, disability, housing condition, and other equity indicators so that we have a better idea of where communities may be disproportionately impacted in our region. And that's going to inform CMAP's future work and in policy and planning. And then we're interested too in helping local governments, both counties, municipalities, and others prioritize and implement some of the strategies in the guide. So that's just sort of an open call to you all and anyone who's listening that, we're interested in furthering this work both at CMAP and then across the region. And so certainly if you'd like to get more information on that, I'd be more than happy to give that to you. So that's all I have in terms of the presentation. We do have some discussion questions prepared, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have on both of these efforts. My colleague Kelsey Pudlock's leading up the flood susceptibility index update and had a meeting conflict, but I will try to answer some questions on her behalf. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I'll leave it to the CMAP staff to facilitate the discussion section.
Okay, thanks, Chair Dernbaugh, and thank you, Kate, for the presentation. So you can see the questions on the screen, and some of these are specifically about elements of the project, and some are more conceptually about. I think one thing Kate and I talked about before the meeting was interest in your work in turning equity principles into policy practice or into practice in your programs. Certainly, this project is looking at that in terms of flooding, but that's I think a broader approach that we'd be interested in hearing any lessons learned about. But firstly, about the flood susceptibility index, are there ways that you work on flooding and stormwater issues where this kind of data can help your work, and how would it do so?
I can jump in with not necessarily on under my current purview, but previously. So I guess a question about the susceptibility index, and does it tie out with any repetitive loss computations or data that the federal government keeps through the flood insurance program or FEMA?
Yeah, so FEMA data was one input that we had in the 2017 index. And so we're working on a request to get updated data there. So it will include FEMA, NFIP, and then individual assistance claims that are made when there's a presidentially declared disaster. So there hasn't been one since 2017. So it's mostly an update of the NFIP claims. Yes.
So I think that tying it out with the federal data, especially through the National Flood Insurance Program, the repetitive loss data is important from both a practical perspective and from an equity perspective, because in a lot of cases, a resident that might have repetitive flooding losses and insurance losses becomes uninsurable, or the insurance rates go up. So there's an equity issue there. Oftentimes they're in the most disinvested areas as well. And then from a practicality perspective, typically the federal funding is directed to repetitive losses first, under the premise that there's a financial loss associated with those and they should be addressed first. So I think just as a point of tying out the data for those parties who ultimately pursue the work, having it include the National Flood Insurance Program repetitive loss data would be important.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Hi, Edith Macra. Just a question on, I guess, integrating in the data that you're using. So we're really interested in following the environmental justice mapping tools and categorizing tools that are out both from the federal government and the state government. There are 4 that I'm aware of, 2 from the federal government's climate and economic justice screening tool, EJ Screen, and then at the state level, there's EJ Screen, I'm getting the names wrong, and then one that was created for Illinois Solar for All that that you use a lot of data. Is it something that you're sort of overlaying on or pulling into? How are you working with those tools, and then which ones do you pick? Because they differ a lot.
Yeah, we did do some research on all of the tools that are out there, including the 4 that you referenced. I'm trying to think if there's another one that we looked at. I know the federal government had their standards for the NEVI, the electric vehicle program. So what we are doing at this point in time is we are compiling a geodatabase that can be used. We're clearly outlining which of those data sets directly are pulled from the CJIS, the Climate and Environmental Justice Screening Tool. So that's what's going to be used by the federal government for Justice 40 implementation. And so we're pulling in the ones that are that we've found through research and engagement to be most relevant to flooding impacts. Although we are incorporating, some health factors in that, but so the guide's going to outline a table of that data. Some of the data that we are pulling is also from EJ Screen, so we're making that very clear. I think that this work is kind of coming ahead of some of the work that the agency that CMAP will be taking on to develop equity indicators for the region. So at this point through this work, we're going to compile the database, make that available, have it linked in the plan, but we're not going so far as to creating a new tool that can be used. We really want to make sure that it's very clear that we are we're relying heavily on data that the federal government will be using for investment decisions, but we know that in the assessment of vulnerabilities, for example, there's really other more local data that can be really helpful to look at that isn't captured in some of these other tools. So we are trying to cast a bit of a wider net.
But thank you.
Hey, any further thoughts or questions from committee members about barriers to putting equity principles into practice, or what might be needed to help local governments, yours or others, use these resources?
So I do have a question about the local government angle, the third question in the list. And I'm wondering, when you send out this updated index, do you do outreach to the professional engineering associations, like local chapters in the Chicago region, or how do you get that information to the engineers working for local governments?
So that's a really great question, and something that we'll be building in, and we should build into our communications plan. I would say, yeah, we've certainly presented at the Illinois Association of Stormwater and Floodplain Managers, for example. But any particular examples that you have, if it's the Public Works Association. Yeah, I think what we're going to be doing in the fall is really developing our communications plan. You know, we have our climate newsletter and our other e-blasts that go out, but we do want to have a more personal touch, so that we're really making sure that, you know, the right people are getting the information.
Yeah, Edith.
I'm really interested in question number 3 too, for local governments, and I don't know the answer to that, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are. I mean, one of the things that strikes me that's so valuable about looking at the flood susceptibility index map is the regionality of it. But how does that scale to the jurisdictions making decisions? And I don't have the answers, but what are your thoughts about how that translates to the governments that are managing property and making decisions and investments?
Yeah, so I think, well, we have focused on the county stormwater jurisdictions, given, you know, the amount of investments that really go through counties. But at the municipal level, I think that when you're looking at, well, Chicago, for example, but the more dense inner ring suburbs, Cicero, Berwyn, the index doesn't do a good job of really deciphering risk. And I think that's because the flood risk in those communities is so tied to the underlying sewer issues. And they're so uniformly developed that it's not getting picked up in the index. But I do think as you move out to, you know, more suburban towns and cities, it does pick up differences. We used it in Wilmington, for example, and I think it was a useful tool. So what CMAP is committed to doing is using it through our technical assistance program in our local planning. And what we did the first time around was we did create a guide that started to walk through how it could be used. I think that, I mean, we know we can't just put a guide out and expect it to be used. So we're interested in getting some new ideas and thinking about how our technical assistance in the resilience space can be a bit more hands-on and maybe smaller scale, so that it is focused on, these are the data tools that we have. What I'm not talking about today is a heat vulnerability index that will be done pretty soon for the region. And that falls in the same line of work. How can we really provide some more guidance so that these tools can be used?
I suppose I'm stepping back to the first question here, so apologies for going backwards, but can you just, given the nature of this committee, can you just share some of the specifics about how climate and future climate scenarios were incorporated into the susceptibility index?
Yeah, so it wasn't included in the first one, although we did include rainfall distribution patterns in the region. So what we're looking at considering in the update, so the work that's been done now is really the research and the engagement to figure out how will we update the index, and then the update will actually happen in the coming months. And so one way that we're looking to the future at future climate impacts is like I said, expanding the geographic extent of the Riverine Index so that it encompasses the 500-year floodplain instead of just the 100-year floodplain. We've known through talking with some of the different stormwater agencies that they are seeing riverine flooding at that 500-year extent, at least in certain watersheds. So that's one thing that we're doing. And if Kelsey were here, she could answer. I think there's one more factor that we're looking at. But yeah, when we get into testing out the methodology and the factors, we'll have a better sense of what actually will be considered in that update.
Just bouncing off the chair's question, I'm curious about existing climate susceptibilities. So I recognize that you're looking at complaints, flooding complaint reports, but what about looking at lakeshore erosion and susceptibility on a more hyper-local community basis, as well as sinking issues, especially in the more dense urban areas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Sinking we haven't looked at. I will say, I think one of the new data layers that we are incorporating is the data from the Environmental Law and Policy Center from the Water Rising report that did project future high lake level elevations. And so, yeah, I would say the lake issues were not captured at all in the 2017 index, and that is something that we're looking at incorporating this time around. And if you have any other data suggestions, I'd be happy to. I'd love to get those ideas too.
If there's no other questions, thanks very much, Kate.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
We're going to move on to item 4.02, the Plan of Action for Regional Transit Report Update. And for this one, Bill Barnes, Deputy for Regional Policy and Implementation, will provide an update. Oh,
It will actually be
Sorry.
Elizabeth Scott, who is one of the principals in the Regional Policy Implementation, Policy and Implementation team.
apologies.
Sorry about that.
Elizabeth.
I will do my
That's a
best.
liaison.
You're
Bill impression. And he's right there, if we need him. Yeah, as Brian said. Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Scott. I'm a principal policy analyst at CMAP. And I'm one of the people in the project management team for our plan of action for regional transit, which is probably the biggest scale effort that CMAP has going on right now. And so I have a little bit of just sort of general project update for you, but rather than give you only general project update, I was hoping to have a bit of a different conversation and ask for your help thinking about the climate impacts of some transportation finance issues. So this presentation is meant to be more conversational, kind of speculative. These are things that we, I think, know less about than we would like to know perhaps one day. So we have several kind of ideas related to the motor fuel tax, related to potentially financializing carbon policies in the future that we hope to just have a little bit of dialogue with you about today, while also giving you the briefest of updates of where we are with the transit project, which is critically important, and we'll make sure you have the materials also. But in order to not bore you, this is what we put together. So yeah, next slide, please. So we all know that the PM 2.5 was really, really bad in the region last month. The 258 is an index. We closed our office because we didn't want staff members traveling to work in the air quality. It's dangerous air quality for people with various health conditions and just bad in general. More than 16 times the standard limit. And so, that's an unusual day. Next slide, please. However, our region continues to be a non-attainment area, you know, around, I think, you know, it's, we measure both ozone and PM 2.5, and CMAP administrates the congestion mitigation and air quality program because of that. But in a broader sense, we know that encouraging mode shift to transit is part of the solution to the air quality issues that we face in the region. It's part of helping to control emissions over time in combination with a variety of other strategies. Next slide, please. And so as I was saying, we're working on this transit project. And as a reminder for all of you, at the heart of the issue is that due to some structural funding issues and due to changes related to COVID-19, our transit system, so all three operators, PACE, Metra, and CTA, along with the Regional Transportation Agency, which oversees them, they are facing in 2026 a fiscal cliff of about $730 million, growing to as much as $1 billion by the end of the decade. So as you can imagine, this is something that we're very, very concerned about, and have been working feverishly for the last year to try to come up with a variety of solutions for how we might address these challenges. Next slide, please. Because we know that, you know, allowing transit to fail is not an option for a variety of reasons that, you know, I'm sure all of you care about the livability of the region, about managing congestion, about the vibrant and walkable communities that transit enables. And of course, top of mind for this group, you know, it's a critical piece of our climate mitigation strategy, you know, both here and across the world. Next slide. And so, understanding all of these issues and understanding the fiscal cliff, there was a piece of legislation that the governor signed at the end of last year, instructing CMAP to develop a set of solutions to the fiscal cliff and a variety of other transit-related questions. So the legislation asked us to opine on a lot of things. I won't read the slide here to you, but it's sort of the way the system is performing today, how it might perform better in the future, and what are transportation finance and governance changes that might be necessary to help it be as good as it can be, while also being solvent. I'll ask if one of our team members can put our PART website in the chat, please. We have, if you go to the CMAP website, we have a subpage for this work. It's got a variety of memos and presentations and, you know, all the information you could want if you want to hear our ideas about buses and everything else. But as I said, I think today we really wanted to focus on the transportation finance piece with you and the climate aspects of transportation finance. Next slide. So this is where we get into this aspect. So there are a variety of revenues that are being considered through this project. And we're just at the stage in the project now where we've kind of surfaced what we think is the set of possible revenues to help meet this $730 million and growing gap, as well as help us make some strategic investments in improving the system and bringing people back to transit. Some of these things, I mean, I'll just say they're all hard, and it is a report, but we're sending it to the legislature and giving them our best policy recommendation for what we think should be done. But there are some of them have limited or potentially negative climate impacts. If the state just simply gives us more money, we're fine with that. We would accept that. Another thing we're looking at is expanding, adding to the RTA sales tax rate in the region, but we know we have an extremely high composite sales tax rate here, which you know, affects economic competitiveness and really hits our low-income residents where it hurts. So, you know, we're a little concerned about that just from a policy perspective. We're looking at expanding Expanding the statewide sales tax to include services, which are many of which are not currently taxed in Illinois. That's a real possibility to move forward. We're also talking about things like payroll tax. We thought about head tax. We thought about utility tax. And then the potential to raise fares on the system. So those things are sort of negligible. And then on, and I guess I put raising fares on the negative side. If we believe that making transit more expensive will have people not ride as much. That's a question. On the positive side for climate, there are a variety of sort of road pricing things that are under consideration. So one piece is congestion pricing. That's like dynamic congestion related tolling, basically. If the highway is really congested, then there's tolling. There's also just straight tolling that we're looking at, both on existing toll facilities and on IDOT highways that are currently untolled. We've done some modeling about what the potential impacts of a cordon around the loop would be. So that would be like a London or New York style fee to enter downtown at any time or during certain hours. We've also looked at vehicle registration surcharge, motor fuel tax surcharge, so kind of a basket of taxing cars. And then one thing that is really far off on the horizon, but we've also been thinking about and would like, any thoughts that you all have, is options for financializing future carbon policies. So more in the mold of European or West Coast system. But I'll say these are all hard, but when we're thinking about what should be in the recommended revenues basket, these are certainly considerations that we're looking at, and not just for climate, but a variety of other things, equity, implementability, and so on. Next slide, please. So I'm interested in road pricing as a long-term solution to the transit finance issues, because we think there's a strong nexus. It's leveraging a less sustainable mode to fund a more sustainable mode. And we think that this kind of pricing can help encourage behavior change by changing the cost difference between modes. So probably something you all are aware of is that the sort of true price of driving is somehow mitigated by the amount that the public sector carries for the cost of road infrastructure and so on. If driving becomes a little bit more expensive, then that changes the economics for people that much in that little bit. There's also some timing issues. Right now, the motor fuel tax is paying for a very great deal of our transportation infrastructure, and it is eroding over time for good reasons, because the more electric vehicles penetrate into the market, the less gas tax there is at the pump, So eventually we will have no motor fuel tax. So we have to come up with a solution there as well. And so the connection being, if there's no motor fuel tax, but there is some kind of user fee for the movement of vehicles, that could be a reasonable replacement for motor fuel tax over time. Okay, next slide, please. But people may say, well, if we have 100% electric vehicle or zero emissions vehicle penetration, do we need to price things? I mean, are we not in a world where the issue, so to speak, has been solved because we don't have internal combustion vehicles going around and polluting the region? And I would argue no, because car-based, let's see, how do I say this? There are a variety of externalities related to cars and the development patterns that are still going to continue to be an issue as time goes on, not to mention the emissions related to batteries and developing and maintaining road infrastructure. So it's a demand management strategy, even in a world where there's a total EV penetration, we may still want to look at road pricing. So for all of these reasons, we kind of feel like road pricing is good and we have a crisis in front of us. And we're trying to think of a way that road pricing can be part of the solution set. But it may end up being sort of something easier now, setting up for something harder, being road pricing concepts over time. Next slide, please. So here's a little discussion with you all. So I'm intentionally trying to be a little provocative with some of this. So please take it with a grain of salt. But considering all of these things, I'm wondering if anyone has thoughts about what it might take to embrace more climate positive sort of revenue strategies. So in the category of the road pricing, rather than say sales tax, or another tax that does not have a necessarily positive climate impact. That's one piece. And then just reflecting on the EV and motor fuel tax kind of question. I know it's a little complicated, so I hope y'all are with me. Yes, please.
What about incentives to start using public transportation more? I mean, you've got the tax, and of course we
Yeah.
know that people don't like that word. But we do live in a community and a shared world, so we have to pay for things that we all use. But incentives is a nice way to kind of help with behavior change, because our country especially is so wedded to their cars. I mean, historically, we all know this. The auto industry is just, people love their cars and they might want to go somewhere after work, and drive somewhere. And so we just don't have it built into our mentality. Now I got a ride to the train station this morning. Woke my son up and he took me to the train station using our Nissan Leaf. I never come into the city other than taking the train, except for the Chicago Triathlon, bikes are hard. But, so that's one thing. I don't know what that would look like, but maybe someone who rides often, or maybe just some kind of incentive like you get when you have solar panels on your roof. And, nature-based solutions to climate change, like a front yard prairie. There could be, I think Minnesota is doing incentives for people who incorporate front yard prairies into their landscape. So just kind of a word semantic thing, incentives.
Yeah, interesting. And of course, I'll just note that there are plenty of areas in our region where transit is less of a realistic option for people, and we still have, car-based development patterns, and that's okay. That's okay. But it's just thinking about all of these things in context with one another. Incentives is an interesting idea. Any other?
Yeah. What are we doing to base our, or maybe pre-screen our revenue ideas to be politically viable ideas? I mean,
That is one of the
I'd
criteria,
love
yes.
I'd love to suggest taxing the rich, any number of other progressive ideas. But MFT, perfect example that, if we're not communicating such a plan with labor, then we are,
Right.
spitting in the wind.
Yeah, and I'll say that we do have a steering committee for this project that includes labor representation, and we've gotten some very strong feedback from some of those partners about how they feel about the MFT being part of the solution. But it's a weird moment for us because everyone has strong feelings about something and none of them are the same.
And actually, do you mind expanding on the steering committee a little bit? I
Sure.
brought up the labor and MFT, but just broader speaking in terms of how we are navigating partners to make this not just be a plan that sits on a desk that everyone looks at and goes, that was nice. And then
Yeah.
they go back to their.
Yeah, absolutely. So the legislation that the governor gave us specifies who needed to be included in the steering committee. So that in a way made it easy for us. The steering committee for the project is an advisory group, so they're not voting, but it's made up of advocates, labor, business leaders, sort of civic sphere kind of people, former legislators, we did our best to try and bring people in who could help us prepare for the arguments that would be necessary to be successful in the future. And they have been giving us a lot of feedback, a lot. And that's been really, really great. I'll say we also have been meeting with all of the county board chairs and the county boards themselves. Ultimately, CMAP's board and the MPO policy committee will need to vote on this report in order to send it to the legislature. So we've been doing quite a lot of talking to everyone about what acceptable solution sets could be.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So I have a comment about this, and I know I always get cranky when it comes to transit and all I see are options that involve charging more for something.
Okay.
You know, it's a road fee, it's if you want to get into the city of Chicago, it costs you more. It's raising fares. So I think along with communicating in this plan, a component of the communication has to be, what are these agencies doing to reduce their costs?
Yep.
And what are they doing to improve the climate? And it may be just, you know, if their corporate office has 3 acres that are being mowed, you know, are you
Right.
putting that back to prairie? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I think a component of the communication has to be, what are they doing to positively impact their high costs? And I'm sorry, I'm cranky.
Honestly, you're not the first person to give us that feedback either. So, you know, I think part of the way we've been framing that is that it would be for any solution, it'll be necessary for transit to be at the table as part of the solution in terms of containing future cost growth and managing fares to keep pace with inflation. Yes.
Oh, me already. So 2 thoughts. One that's just kind of come up before, Cynthia's idea about incentives and Martha's suggestion that we don't raise, fares. I've been to part presentations before, as I know this is part of who's on the steering committee. But could we really lean on employers to provide some of those incentives to their workers? I think that's one revenue stream that we haven't really seen, and that does, you know, there's local decisions between the employer and the employee where that could help. So that's one solution. The bigger question, which again, I don't have the answer for, but really interested in the nexus between motor fuel tax and reducing car use and funding transit. And we have a project at the Mayor's Caucus called EV Readiness, which we're really interested in long-term viability and helping municipalities prepare for electrification. And we're struggling with the motor fuel tax. And you just mentioned that is going to time out or dry up, which is totally true. But can you use this moment with the focus on part to help fix motor fuel tax for everybody long-term so that there are revenue sources for local governments that heavily rely on that, but that, you know, EV drivers are paying their fair share of an infrastructure that they're going to be using, and that the system, you know, gets fixed and also funds transit. And I know it's a really big task, but you guys are up to it. So
I was just
good luck with that one.
Edith. No, I get you. One of the memos that's forthcoming from our team, and so they should have shared the link to the project website, which has a variety of memos, more are coming, is about what it's going to take to move to a road user charge in Illinois to replace the MFT, and whether there's an opportunity for transit as part of that. And we think, you know, a federal solution ultimately will be necessary, but there are things that states can do to prepare, states and regions. So we're thinking in that direction also. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So a couple of thoughts. You know, we at CDOT, we talk to a lot of different cities about the strategy, in particular congestion pricing, user fees, et cetera. And you know, in New York City, the American example that we're all looking at these days, everyone knew that this is what they needed to do to save transit in terms of investing back into a really underinvested system. So I think the messaging, you know, climate is probably not going to motivate folks talking about it in terms of climate, but air quality, saving transit, et cetera. And obviously there's different groups, and there's the municipal, the federal, the state, all different audiences, et cetera. in terms of, just thinking about, we're thinking a lot about electrification these days in terms of thinking about the types of vehicles that have the heaviest impact. We're thinking a lot about freight. And obviously that's critically important to the economy here in the region. So thinking about just, are there certain revenue models that we want to think about in terms of freight electrification? I know there's a lot of limits around how you use certain grants and revenue, but that is something to think about and think about how we can be innovative about. And then as well as just doing everything we can to incentivize those larger vehicles to make the jump, because certainly there's a huge cost premium there. And then as well as something that we think a lot about too is trying not to think as narrowly as just about electric vehicles, but e-mobility broadly. We're really clear-minded that the city has a mode shift goal. I don't believe the state has a mode shift goal, but starting to talk about it in terms of this is a critical strategy to improve air quality, et cetera. And then, think about places where we're putting charging, those are opportunities to, provide opportunities for folks to charge other devices, to build community around those places. So there's a lot of other benefits that can come from it.
Yeah, those are all really good thoughts. I do not think the state has a mode shift goal, but that's an interesting idea.
So,
Yeah.
I'll pick up on something Mary just added, but maybe I'll put on the hat of some of the committee members who aren't here, the public health professionals, which is, and thanks for starting your presentation with the recent air quality extremes that we saw here and probably going to see a little bit this week. It seems to me that, the pricing requirements that we'll have in the future could be informed by that dynamic. And, I think that's in some ways easier to communicate, difficult to implement, and certainly difficult to implement equitably, but has a great opportunity to communicate very directly mode shift through pricing. So force it, on days of poor air quality, if you do have the infrastructure for some of that tolling or cordon pricing, then the prices go up and you really get the benefit or impact that you're looking for. So I think just tying it to air quality and air quality messaging, both from a communication perspective, but also just from a real harm, could be something to incorporate into those. And, I know that's sort of, we've seen examples and maybe extreme examples of that in other parts of the world, but that public health impact probably is one easier to communicate.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think it feels potentially more immediate and related to human people that you actually know or you might know. So that's not a framing that we've really experimented with, but that's an interesting one to note for the future. So I have a few even more speculative slides, which I want to maybe continue on to. Do we have time, Jamie, Brian? How are we doing on time?
Yeah, that sounds great.
okay.
Thanks.
Okay, super. You guys have given us a lot to think about. So this is like really kind of out there, and I'll tell you, this is definitely not my policy area. It's something we're trying to learn about, though. I thought just a few teaser slides and maybe y'all have thoughts. So you may be aware that in California and parts of Canada, and I believe parts of Europe, carbon trading is a pretty robust market. So the, basic idea is that you have the community, whether that's a, state, it sets a limit on carbon emissions, and then emitters emitters are able to buy credits to kind of buy themselves out of some regulatory limitations. But the idea is that the amount that is allowable goes down over time. So it's not just saying like, oh, it's fine, you can be dirty and gross as long as you pay forever. That is not how it works. But the revenues from this system can be used to support transit and other green investments, so it's something we've been looking at. Next slide, please. So like the main example is California. And in the sixties, they created this group, the California Air Resources Board, CARB. So CARB has been huge, in their kind of like state climate, I guess, policy portfolio, you could say. Let's see here. I've got some good notes. I mean, it was part of creating the first tailpipe emission standards in the US. CARB is part of the California EPA. It is the lead agency for climate change programs. In 2006, Governor Schwarzenegger signed Assembly Bill 32, which is the California Global Warming Solutions Act. It set an emissions target of reducing GHG emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. That was achieved in 2016. And as a part of that action, they created their cap and trade program. So next slide, please. So here's a kind of a picture of how that is looking over time. Let's see here. Let me just read the notes so I don't get this wrong. So they started their California started their cap and trade program in 2013, expanded to include transportation, natural gas, and other fuel distributors in 2015. CARB administrates this. Cap is set 2% below emissions level forecast for 2012, and then they decline it a little bit annually until they sort of like hit the out year goal. It covers 85% of California emissions, but since they have started quarterly auctions where emitters can buy credits, as of 2022, they had generated nearly $20 billion in revenue that is spent on transit and other kind of green infrastructure projects. So that's a lot of money. And so the red line there is the business as usual, like what would be happening in the absence of any intervention. And then you can see the cap projected to go down over time. So there won't infinitely be credits that can be purchased, but there are credits now, is my very basic understanding. Next slide, please. And so it's not just them. There's also the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in Northeastern United States. California has established a joint program with Quebec. To the north, Washington State is doing things. Maybe some of you know about this Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. I know if Nora Beck was here, she would know more about it than I do. And certainly talking about our climate action plan is kind of where the rubber meets the road on some of this next step stuff. So I know Brian is about to give you all an overview of that too. But kind of the question is this interesting? Does this feel like something that is like what crazy people on the West Coast do, or is it something worth us starting to explore more seriously or with greater interest? And maybe we simply don't have enough information.
I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
Not crazy.
Mhm. Okay, I agree.
I have one more question. Is
Sure,
it,
of course.
is it just a tax if you go over the cap, or are you purchasing offsets? Or is it some combination?
Great question. I don't know the answer to that. Does one of our team members know the answer to that?
So you're effectively buying an offset, like an offset that allows you to emit to that level. So you're purchasing, say, X amount, you're purchasing this credit that allows you to emit X amount and like not deal with the limit. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Jesse.
I ask for a little bit more amplification of that business model. I'm not I mean.
Sure. So my basic understanding of this is that the cap is the total, emissions limit. And that the cap goes down over time, but within the cap, you can buy credits.
So, yeah, this is, my understanding is that based on the cap, a certain number of credits are released every year based on the limit that's set by the regulating agency. And then within that, each emitter, in this case, I'm not sure about how it would work for transportation related things, but for like, say, power plants, that they issue these limits, these credits that allow them to have a certain level of emission for that a particular year. Now, if they did, certain implementation on the technology to improve or to reduce their emission, they don't have to use up that entire credit. So it will allow them to trade the remaining credit in the open market. And when you have a market like that, it offers third party to come in and then purchase these credits as offsets. So therefore, you would further even reduce the emission within that year. So that's kind of my understanding on a typical cap and trade program.
So because the regulatory agency is reducing the limit over time, then the emitters are incentivized to reduce their emissions in order to spend less on the credits.
Yes, correct.
Sorry, I interrupted you. I apologize.
Except in the transaction, everything still depends on their ability to reduce and use technology that produces the reduction. And where does the money go?
Can be invested into green uses.
Who-
I think it goes to the state.
Yes, so it goes to, in California, they have a specific funds that all the money goes to, a greenhouse gas reductions fund. That fund is controlled by the state. CARB has a large part of that, and they work with the state to determine different projects that this money could then go to. So those could be climate investments in transportation, and infrastructure in any number of areas. And so all the money that is produced from these auctions goes into this fund that the state can then invest in climate solutions.
That's the invest part, where investment is made in GHG reduction technology
Yes,
by that board or fund.
and projects, yeah.
Or transit, green infrastructure projects, things that in general should contribute to reducing emissions.
So wouldn't the governing body, whether it's a state or local, have to subtract the cost of purchasing that carbon credit from, whether it's someone who's generating green energy or a block of forest that would sequester a certain amount of carbon? Isn't there a cost that would have to be subtracted off that before the governing agency would have funds to do other things with?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure.
So, somebody have another question? So I'm gonna move us along just a
yeah.
little bit here, except to say, just as maybe as a way to sort of wrap up this piece of the question, is that, I know the state of Illinois had looked at certainly a cap and trade market participation 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And with a group of other Midwest states, I
Mhm.
think there had been some rumbling that might be revisited in the last year or two. I don't know the status of that, if anybody does, or maybe that's a question to CMAP to go do
Find someone who
do that
knows.
diligence. But also, we don't have a CARB like they do in California. However, we do have a state climate bank.
Yeah.
And, with large influx of resources going in there through a variety of federal opportunities, including the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund under the Inflation Reduction Act. It seems like this would be another potential next step, would be to have a conversation with the state climate bank. I know they're funding electric vehicle infrastructure, but are there other transit and transportation related investments that a state climate bank could help facilitate? As far as administrator for how, if there was value to carbon reductions over here, and if there were carbon reducing initiatives over here, could make that connection. So maybe that would be a suggestion of exploration.
Yeah,
Again,
those
with,
are.
with
those
all
are
the knowledge I have
Really
on
good
how
thoughts.
what is or isn't happening at those different agencies. So.
Mr. Chair, if I could throw out there just the side note, if we are going to explore a cap and trade program, that we have some sort of intentions of ensuring that any funds that are acquired from that are redirected back to the communities that are they're essentially enabling these polluters, are being forced to host these polluters through a purchased additional polluting, existence.
Here, Thomas, and I know you want to move things ahead, Aaron, but I just want to say the kerfluffle around the word trade versus the word invest.
Sure.
Because, Chicago loves a market, they don't care what the outcome is as long as they can make some money on it. So that was part of the problem with the original iteration of the trade. The invest makes a lot more sense, especially as Thomas has noted, if that investment moves the equity metric for those who suffer the most harm from those polluters.
Thank you, Naomi and Thomas. Well stated, both of you. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and just because the members aren't able to see the chat, I did want to note that in the chat online, Brian Larson noted that there was a Chicago Climate Exchange from 2003 to 2010, which was a GHG allowance trading platform that included companies, states, and municipalities that went inactive due to decreased speculation. It was voluntary to join, but that is a concept that's been explored locally that does get revived from time to time.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you to the
That's
chat.
awesome feedback. Thank you all for a really good conversation. So I appreciate you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Moving on, item 4.03, Regional Climate Action Planning. For this item, member Edith Macra from Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus and Brian Daly, the staff liaison to this committee, and a senior planner will present work on the US EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. Edith and Brian.
Thank you, Chair Dernbaugh. Good morning and thank you. You may recognize me from my other role as one of the liaisons to the Climate Committee, but I'm Brian Daly. I'm a senior planner here. Edith Macra and I wanted to talk about a little bit more about something that we introduced at the April meeting that we now know more about, which is current regional climate action planning activities and also some exciting opportunities through a US EPA program called the Carbon Pollution Reduction Grant that will open the door to climate mitigation funding opportunities for counties and municipalities. So we spoke about this at April, but since then, our organizations have formed a partnership to create a work plan for a regional climate action plan that the Mayor's Caucus will lead. So we wanted to talk a little bit to frame the current thinking about how we're approaching this and how we're approaching carbon pollution reduction goals in our region. The fact that the climate crisis is here is not news to you. This is something we talk about at every meeting. But one thing I wanted to call attention to is the note that to preserve a livable planet, we must reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which is a more ambitious goal than the ON to 2050 plan, which was an 80% reduction from 1990 levels. So we must reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and we want to talk about some of the ways we're going to try to do that as a region. So on the next slide, this shows, and this is something you've seen before, this is from recent greenhouse gas emissions inventories for the region. Our greenhouse gas emissions are going down, but not fast enough to reach these goals. Given current climate data, we now know that a net zero emissions goal is key to stopping the trend of global warming. And this graphic shows that that number is dropping, but the target line here is even just for the ON to 2050 goal, not the net zero goal. And you can see that the trend is not keeping up with where we need it to be to achieve that target. So on the next slide, this breaks down a little bit about where emissions are coming from in the region. Now, given our role as CMAP, you've heard a lot from us about transportation-related emissions. That's a big focus of our work on climate, but that's not the only sector that emissions are coming from. So while we know that about a third of greenhouse gas emissions in northeastern Illinois are coming from transportation, and projects that you've been hearing about, like PART, which we just heard about, work on electric vehicles and things like that. Those all focus on reducing the emissions for that 1/3 of our total. But that means 2/3 of the emissions are coming from other sources, from industry, from manufacturing, from generating electricity, from heating and cooling buildings. So to achieve the climate future we all want to see, we can't look only at the transportation sector. And that's one of the promising things about this new work that we're doing, is it will give us the opportunity to look beyond transportation at some of the many sectors that are in play here. So on the next slide, this is just to introduce the program that we'll be talking about today. So I think Edith will, so I'll just start by saying that the Inflation Reduction Act recently established, that's the federal legislation, that established $5 billion to support state and municipal development and implementation of plans for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And CMAP and the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus will be partnering to pursue this work. So I will turn it over to Edith to discuss the program.
Thank you for that. And it's really great to partner with CMAP to lead this regional initiative for climate planning. So next slide, please. So the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant is a program that EPA has spun up very, very quickly in response to the Inflation Reduction Act. And they are building on the strategy of regional climate planning, which is still very, very new. So we've really been enjoying watching EPA be responsive and listen to what can be done, and looking at the strengths of organizations throughout the US to develop climate action plans and who can do that. The real target is implementation funding. So the federal government is looking to really invest in very quick, very high priority climate mitigation strategies, and they need plans that are targets. So that's really how to look at this backwards. It's the way I've been looking at it. It's all about the implementation, but you can't implement if you don't have a plan, and we all need plans really quickly. So when you see the timeline, keep that in mind, that the federal government is looking for quick action, investment, who can do a plan and who can do it really quickly, and how can the US EPA help them. So they created a formula grant program, meaning it's not competitive, and they created 2 tiers of investment. So they offered money to every state, all but 4 accepted the funding. And that's a $3 million investment to every state to develop a state level climate action plan, a little bit quicker timeline than the regional ones. And then they picked the 67 largest municipal statistical areas and offered formula funding to them as well. They gave us more time because of the nature of an MSA doesn't pair neatly with the geography of a regional planning agency or a metropolitan region. It was, as the EPA said, it was messy. And our MSA, you'll see, includes multiple states. So, but still a neat idea. And then again, regional climate planning is relatively new, but they thought this was a great approach to try to zero in on metropolitan areas as well. They do have criteria for what that climate action plan, both at the state and what at the MSA level requires, including specific plans for the climate action plan, which is, just to reiterate, it's focused on mitigation only. This is not adaptation plan, but climate action elements that are focused on mitigation, focus on air quality. That is the congressional authority of the US EPA. They have requirements for stakeholder engagement and Justice 40 equity requirements. So the MSA, and then the previous slide just had the amount of money, $4.6 billion, which is coming out very, very quickly for implementation. But our MSA includes, as you can see, portions of Wisconsin and portions of Indiana, and the climate action plan that we have for the region includes just Illinois, and it actually includes some of the counties in Rockford that are not on this map. So this is where it starts to get messy immediately. And then all of the Indiana and Wisconsin are also doing state level plans. So no, we have to overlay all of the state plans with the MSAs, but CMAP has partnerships with other planning councils in Sewer Pack in Wisconsin and NERC in Indiana. And so we've been working out a plan that would be more inclusive of these regions, looking at very, very different emissions mix. But the purpose of the plan, kind of back to that, is the way we're seeing it. EPA gave us all these criterias, our MSA, including the partnership, specifically the partnership with CMAP, is looking at harnessing existing work and partner expertise. So this is where it's an advantage to pull in our colleagues from the other states, the other metro regions, for CMAP to bring in their considerable expertise, and then to build on the work that the Mayor's Caucus has done as well too. The real driver is to position the region to be competitive for the implementation dollars. Everybody's really interested and concerned about that. And then additionally, we're looking at how we can make this stick in the long term. So how can we use this process to really cement the region with a climate action plan that works for regional leadership in the long run? Next slide, please. So the timeline on this is somewhat crazy in the short term. And when CMAP and the Mayor's Caucus were talking about this, we kind of had to back out and say, we have to get a priority climate action plan done in 8 months. And that is crazy. I mean, we have a climate action plan in the region, and it's still crazy. So, but Congress, EPA wants to release that funding for implementation really quickly. So they've made the priority climate action plan more formula. Here's what we'd like you to do. They're looking for very high level commitments of our priority implementation ideas. So what are the actions? How can you get there quickly? There are requirements, but they recognize that we have to know what we need to do as a region to reduce emissions. That's really what the priority climate action plan is. And the Mayor's Caucus is going to lead on that because of our existing climate action plan. And ironically, because the Mayor's Caucus is small, we're nimble. So we can get something done in 8 months. But really over the long term, CMAP is the regional planning agency. And so they've graciously agreed to embrace the comprehensive climate action plan and put more muscle and expertise into enhancing the priority climate action plan over time to build on strengths, to integrate transportation, to broaden it. So they have a longer lead time on that, with a full comprehensive climate action plan due in the summer of 2025. They've got more opportunity for engagement and to integrate with regional goals. And CMAP is really looking to embrace this and make it a part of CMAP's decision-making and leadership long into the future. Likewise with the status report. So EPA is asking for out to 2027, the length of this project or engagement is to report back on how things are being done, how things are being integrated. And that is, again, something that CMAP will lead for MSA. Next slide, please. So you may have seen this, but this is the foundation for the priority climate action plan. So the Mayor's Caucus in 2021 released this regional plan. It was pioneering at the time, still somewhat pioneering. There were only 3 climate action plans for the region done through this partnership with the Global Covenant of Mayors. And the plan really provides an excellent foundation, but has limitations, of course. This was focused on municipal action because that's who we are. We're a regional council of governments for municipalities, but we did regional analysis. And CMAP was a partner on this project, but the NOAA was the co-author on our plan with Global Covenant of Mayors support. And it does include adaptation, which sadly we can't move forward on any of these through this climate pollution reduction grant project. Next slide, please. But it does have targets which are useful to build on. And the next slide will show you what those science-based targets are about. But we do have a goal of net zero emissions. We also have a target of 80% reductions, which aligned with what CMAP's target has been as well. In the next slide, I'll demonstrate what that means about having a goal and a target. a little bit differently. So next slide, there we. So many of you have seen the wedge before, the climate wedge, and understand this, but just to go over how we generated goals and how we generated the strategies, this is what is required for the climate pollution reduction grant. But we build on, and our plan for the Mayor's Caucus Climate Action Plan for the region is built on the 2015 emissions inventory that CMAP did. So your baseline, if you would animate with me, Jamie, you'll see so that the baseline is the measurement starts at 2015. Jamie, if you would tap, there's just a little bit, yeah, a little bit of arrows just to help you understand it. So that's where emissions reductions are our starting point. And then if you follow that dotted line across the top of the wedge, that's business as usual projections. And another tap will demonstrate that. So the goal, one more tap, is to drive down emissions reductions back to net zero there at the bottom of the chart. But to explain what's happening in the wedge, you'll see that really pretty green bar across the bottom that says needed innovation. We used a modeling tool that was provided to us by the World Bank through this project that we engaged in with the Global Covenant of Mayors. And that tool we were unable to demonstrate getting to net zero with any of the tools and mechanisms that we had. But we know we need to get there. So that's where you get a difference between the science-based target of it's a little bit over 80% and the goal of net zero. But this is the limitations of the regional analysis that we've done. This is the limitation of the tools that we've had. And another advantage for having CMAP's expertise on a longer term is to really drill down to more solutions and improve the data and the tools and the analysis. But not to go over all of the details, but the different colors and the wedges really was the foundation for our mitigation objectives, and there are 8 of them in the climate action plan. And so if you look at, for example, the biggest wedge in the middle is the periwinkle color, or the kind of the medium blue, and that's decarbonized energy sources. That's focusing on power plants. You can see the medium blue or sky blue is decarbonized transportation, and others there included building energy, climate energy policy. We broke it down in sensible ways for strategies. Again, the difference here was that these were sort of scaled for municipal action, and that's something that we know over the long term CMAP will be able to improve on over time. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Edith. So the second deliverable is a comprehensive climate action plan. And whereas Edith pointed out that the Mayor's Caucus is nimble, watch what happens when the CMAP snowball starts rolling down the hill. So we will be spending time over the next couple of years adding to some of the strategies that are in the PCAP and the existing climate action plan to encompass all the significant greenhouse gas sources and sinks, and that includes the sectors that are listed here on the slide. So energy generation, commercial and residential buildings, but also some of the topics that we haven't engaged with as much, which I'll be asking about in a couple of minutes, like agriculture and natural lands. And again, not just looking at the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, but the potential for some of these resources to act as sinks for carbon, which is a part of the regional emissions profile overall. The CCAP will also include an analysis of co-benefits. So this relates to what Elizabeth was talking about with PART, looking at things like particulate emissions, which are not one-to-one with carbon emissions, but the plan asks all the participants to assess what the strategies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions will also do for reducing other types of emissions and carrying other kinds of benefits like workforce benefits and things like that. So we'll be doing an analysis of co-benefits and specific analysis of benefits to low income and disadvantaged populations as defined by the EPA for this project. So we did want to highlight the range of sectors that this plan will address. And then on the next slide, this is something we alluded to at the beginning as well, which is the implementation funding. So there's 2 phases of the program, a planning phase and an implementation phase. The EPA has released some preliminary information about the funding phase. We don't know all the details yet, but here's a little bit that we do know. There will be $4.6 billion total in competitive implementation grants. The individual grants will range anywhere from $2 million to $500 million. But then within the program, there will also be tiers. So the $2 million projects will not be competing head to head with the $500 million projects for funding. That'll allow comparably sized projects to compete against one another. We're anticipating an application deadline of around April 30th, 2024, although we don't know for sure. But more details on this funding opportunity are expected to be released in September. And some of the evaluation criteria are greenhouse gas reduction, as you'd expect, as well as benefits to low-income and disadvantaged communities. And then on the next slide, just one last bit of information, just to keep you updated. Before the US EPA grant opportunity, CMAP also engaged in efforts, was engaged in efforts to mitigate emissions from the transportation sector. And as part of that, we were working with Argonne National Laboratory to leverage their sophisticated modeling support to envision what solutions might achieve the most effective emissions reductions. So we applied with Argonne and ComEd for a competitive funding opportunity through the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which would allow us greater access to the national labs to help analyze various strategies for a variety of sectors. So we submitted this application. We're still waiting for word back. This is, again, through NREL. So if we are successful, that would give us, one more arrow in the quiver for doing the kind of analysis we're going to need to do as part of the EPA program, and we will keep you all updated on the status of this work. So that's the overview of the program. We do have a few discussion questions on the next slide. We'd be interested in hearing from you about how a regional approach could support your needs. The Mayor's Caucus did an excellent plan that, as Edith said, was focused a lot on municipal actions. So how can connecting that to some regional strategies help meet your needs? I know for us, looking ahead to the CCAP, one thing we're really interested in is if you all know of any current work in some of those non-transportation sectors that you think our planning teams and our partnerships should incorporate, if there's people or organizations leading that you think we should be in touch with. And also curious about what your needs are for planning and for implementation. Yeah, Cynthia.
Thank you. Just thinking about that wedge, and also how this also connects or can connect with the Illinois is Beautiful, the 30 by 30 program, and that goal of in protecting 30% of our land by 2030, because that, of course, acts as a reducer of the greenhouse gases, and when we increase those natural areas. So is that sort of effort considered in parallel to this and working toward that? Because that would be obviously something the Prairie State Conservation Coalition is very interested in, and protecting more of our land, Nachusa style, large swaths of land to get where we want to go, which is going to be really tough since we're at 4% in Illinois. This area is much higher, of course, with that protection, but so just curious about that, and if that wedge would change, if that kind of data were inputted, doesn't bring us closer to zero.
I'll be glad to address that. Jamie, do you mind backing up to the wedge? And I'll show you so the sequestration action is in there. So it's a pretty small little wedge. You did notice it over time. Okay. So the issue that we had with this, and this was the one of the few plans that actually looked at sequestration. So in climate modeling, it's difficult to get the data about sequestration and the results of those actions. So it's just less, it's more fluid and harder to measure, and there's been less work on it than there has in terms of reducing carbon fuel consumption. So that's why it's less clear. So there's work to be done on that, but it is growing, and I know it's an area of interest for all of us. So absolutely yes, we are particularly interested in the plan, the climate action plan for the region, in how the co-benefits are realized. So to see those nature-based solutions provide the co-benefits for adaptation as well, we kind of have to go back out of that now for the climate pollution reduction grant, because they're only interested in mitigation. We don't have clear guidelines from the US EPA in terms of how to measure the sequestration, but certainly in the CCAP, I think that would be something that listening to stakeholders, knowing the co-benefits that we're interested in the region, that'd be something that we would focus on. Thank you.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that, and stepping away from sequestration as a topic specifically. But just to note that, the state of Illinois is doing a plan under this program at the same time, and we've spoken with IEPA, who are leading that effort. So we'll be doing everything we can to align some of those bigger statewide policy goals with what's happening within our region, just as they're applying it at the statewide level.
And just to follow up, wouldn't nature-based solutions be mitigation? Couldn't that be considered mitigation, or am I thinking on a different place?
I think technically it's sequestration, which is different.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So that it's not fossil fuel consumption, which is what this is all about, and the pollution. It is sequestration, or if there are co-benefits in terms of pollution mitigation. But that, to be really geeky government about this, is that's congressional authority that EPA has, is to reduce pollution. And so that's what they really need to demonstrate. So we haven't seen real clear guidance on the sequestration component of it. The work that was done to inform climate action plan for the region stems from the U.S. Forest Service, which is USDA. So it's a little bit trickier just when it gets to modeling and measurements, but
Yeah.
no, I don't believe it's considered mitigation.
Okay, thanks.
Can you just speak a little bit to the work that was done for the priority cap, from the regional cap to the priority cap, incorporating our partners from Wisconsin and Indiana, and how that's gone and is going?
Yeah, so it's just getting going in that, and I guess the honest answer is, I don't know. I don't know. It's very difficult to look at the regions and who's done what work. So our PCAP was really clear on the emissions that we have for the region, building on CMAPs, greenhouse gas inventory, and modeling it. I'm saying this is what we can do. We were really stunned to look at what the emissions inventory is from the Northeast Indiana Regional Planning Commission, which is, do you remember the numbers? It was really scary in terms of industrial emissions.
It was much higher from industrial than.
It was like
than we have in our
60%
region, yeah.
of the, I mean, it was crazy. And so that's just so radically different that we have, we're really stretching that. And then there's also if you saw the map, there's agricultural counties in Indiana. So we're looking for guidance from the EPA on how to do that. The only thing that I can say about it is there's a desire to cooperate amongst the regions. There's a desire to capture that implementation funding. And then we do recognize, of course, that emissions and pollution doesn't follow state boundaries. So there's just a desire to work together. Even EPA has said it's messy. So we're working it out, and we hope to get to a solution that works for all, but it is definitely meshing data sets and meshing priorities and government agencies in an 8-month period. So it's I will say it's probably a light touch. And that the priority climate strategies or objectives that were identified in the PCAP may stretch some, but they probably won't radically change from what we've done, given the amount of time that we have and given what is required by the EPA. So we feel really good about having that foundation to move forward on, and being as responsive as we can to get that work done in the short term, to turn in a plan that is eligible for funding. You want to add to that, Brian?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I would just add that we've had, several great conversations with our colleagues at SURPAC and at NERPC. Everyone was just excited about making sure that their communities are eligible for implementation funding and doing whatever is necessary to make that happen. It's complicated a little bit further by only 2 of the 4 Indiana counties that are included in our MSA are part of NERPC. So we have additional 2 counties. So as Edith was saying, the data that we have for these different areas is not going to be one-to-one, and we're going to have to grapple with that. But that's part of the fun process.
Any other questions for Brian or Edith? And Edith? Go ahead, Samir.
I don't want to stray away from the presentation too much. I just would be remiss if I didn't mention, it'd be super helpful if this came up with like land use recommendations from an industrial perspective. So looking at like air quality and pollution control permitting that is allowed in certain areas, especially when we're looking at population density, near communities where people are actually living, not just like solely industrial sites. and looking at that a little bit more holistically. I think it's something, not to sound Chicago focused, but it's something that cities like Chicago have really struggled with, I think, and, figuring out like who is allowed to operate and where. And looking at this more regionally would, I think, very much aid some of those conversations.
Thank you for that comment. What's been both a little bit of a stress for me, having not worked in air pollution before. But again, CMAP brings the expertise to that. But what's really neat about the climate pollution reduction grant is the pairing of pollutants, other pollutants besides carbon. So that's what's really interesting. And that's again, where some of the strength of EPA and having that regulatory authority to regulate pollutions and look at reducing emissions and pollutants holistically. So, point well taken. Thank you.
All right. Well, I have, I guess, one more question, and it kind of is inspired by the last question there, which is sort of a next steps prompt, which is, when you ask that question about will organizations here in the region be ready to partner for that implementation funding, what is that what do you expect the timeline and criteria and process to look like for those large implementation funds? I know you're focused right now, obviously, on the planning aspect, but right, planning shouldn't stand in the way of implementation. In fact, should it often get out of the way of implementation? So maybe could you speak to that?
This will sound a little bit like, I'm kind of spinning around to questions that are not yet to be answered. But what EPA has told us is that just for assurances. So one partner we didn't mention was City of Chicago. City of Chicago has been very engaged in this process, and they are critical to the decision making in all of this. But everything that is, all of the strategies or objectives, I should say, that are defined in the PCAP are what is eligible for implementation. So that's why the PCAP is so important, to make that as broadly inclusive as and effective as it can be, because that becomes the defining of the what. The who is eligible for funding, and we don't really have clarity from the US EPA yet because they're still working on it. But every jurisdiction that is covered by a climate action plan is eligible. So that means if you have a statewide plan, every jurisdiction in the state of Illinois will be eligible, and every jurisdiction sort of an overlay or a duplicate in the MSA is eligible. So that's what we do know. And other than that, it's just speculating. The range is high. And I think that there might be some advantage to thinking ahead about how to, even if it's a $2 million project, is to think really big or to think collaboratively, and then to start planning ahead for the what and the who, and who you can work with to get those implementation grants done. So yeah, that we don't know a lot more about it.
Yeah, and one other thing that the EPA said, and I don't think this was just in a conversation, but while the funding will begin to be available in 2024, I don't think this is going to be the kind of opportunity that opens once, closes a month later, and that's it. It sounds like this will probably be something that'll be open for a little while, at least as long as that funding is available. And yeah, I think coordination and regional thinking is going to be really important just because of the size of the awards. Even a $2 million award is going to be a lot of money for a smaller municipality to manage. So thinking of projects that meet that thresholds and that are competitive according to what criteria are established, that's going to be something that we hope the planning process helps to kind of foment.
Thank you very much. I look forward to learning more about the planning and the implementation in future meetings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, now we're going to move on to item 5, committee member updates. Do any of the members of the committee that are with us have news about their work they'd like to share? Cindy.
I'm excited to share that the Prairie State Conservation Coalition, along with other partners, is going to be holding a conservation policy retreat later this summer. We're going to have a conservation policy platform in 2024 to deliver and for legislative action, and then also a conservation lobby day So exciting year ahead. We're also busy planning regional conferences around the state so that we get together more often as natural area organizations than not. Once a year is great. We have our annual conference at Starved Rock in March of every year. We are going to be changing that to a more regional location. Since we are a statewide organization, we're going to go down to Pere Marquette in 2025, but we're holding regional conferences that also bring in underrepresented organizations that also work on protecting and preserving natural areas. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I'd like to build off that and say that department is going to be celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Natural Areas Preservation Act, which formed the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, and that will be August 28th at Illinois Beach State Park. So we're really looking forward to that. That's a huge milestone for us.
Any other updates from any of the members? Jack?
The Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago, our Board of Commissioners recently adopted the Climate Action Plan on our board meeting on May 4th this year. And it's going to be a living document and roadmap for MWRD to lower carbon emissions and footprints for the first half of the century. So just to give you some milestones that we included in the action plan, the baseline for 2025 is 28% reduction, and 2040 with an interim goal of 60%, and then 2050 is 80%. And we do have a stretch goal to go up to 100% reduction in 2050. So thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Are there any other updates from any of the committee members? Brian, were there any submitted in advance?
Yes, we received one comment prior to today's meeting. That was from John Paul Jones, President of Sustainable Englewood Initiatives and Nature Trail Consultant with Grow Greater Englewood, which I'll summarize for the record. He's happy to witness CMAP revisiting regional flood susceptibility and said that Chicago's start and stop approach to climate change puts communities at risk. He noted that the update to the FSI will help Greater Englewood's efforts to remedy stormwater matters and described some recent flooding and its effects in the community. He also noted that they are working with Morton Arboretum and the Chicago Region Trees Initiative on tree canopy planting. We also received some comments in the chat over the course of the meeting, some of which I shared, but I'll just direct people to the chat and also note that John Porterfield shared some specific products and services crucial for transformation to zero emissions and atmospheric GHG removal, such as commodity trading and agricultural practices. He also shared regarding PM 2.5 that studies have shown that PM particulate matter can be tied to higher rates of disease, even at levels lower than the EPA standard, and that EVs, according to a study that he provided, place more than twice the stress on roads that petrol vehicles do, or gas-powered vehicles. We also had a question about fugitive emissions, which was clarified that those are mostly from industrial activities and are from equipment leaks and intentional venting and flaring. And we had one question about whether transformation from concrete and steel structural systems to wood is underway. Another attendee provided some information about Chicago's recent building code update. So anyone who's interested can take a look at those.
Thank you. I think that might have jumped ahead a few agenda items, but from the committee member updates to the public
Oh, I'm
comment.
sorry.
That's
Yes,
okay.
that was public comment.
Can we just make sure those are entered under item 7.0 public comment?
Apologies.
Stepping back for just 1 second to item 6, was there any other business in front of the committee? If none, we'll take those comments as entered into item 7.0
I
public
have some
comment.
updates.
That-
I have an update.
Oh, go ahead, Naomi.
The Blacks and Green was recently awarded a Bezos $1.5 million grant for our horticulture work. And so we're very excited to be amping up what we've been doing, pinching from general operating funds, scaling up our green infrastructure at a village scale. So many of you know we have the sustainable square mile system as the fundamental building block of our environmental work. And in that context, from King Drive to Cottage Grove, 60th to South Chicago, we will be doing deep immersion in all kinds of stormwater management, ecological balancing, and nutrient cultivation inside of that walkable village. So tree canopy regeneration is fundamental to that. Food production, how many households can you feed? How many neighbors can you train and engage? How many jobs and businesses can you create? And how many gallons of stormwater can you divert? Those are the 4 questions that we ask and answer with our West Woodlawn Botanic Garden, Village Farm, and Arboretum instrument. And so we're happy to be able to scale it up and to begin to track data where we haven't had the capacity to do that in the past. So more news to come.
Thank you very much. If there are no other comments from the committee or from public comment, I think I'll just announce that our next meeting is scheduled for October 24th, 2023, held in person, probably back in the same space, I assume. Hope to see you all there. And if there's no other business, I'll adjourn today's meeting. Thank you very much. Appreciate being here.
Thank you.